The water pooling at my feet was cold, not the kind that makes you shiver, but the heavy, bone-deep chill that seeps through your socks and stays there. I'd been standing in the basement laundry room for 10 minutes, staring at a steady drip from the main junction like it owed me an explanation. It didn't, because pipes never do. My fuzzy pajama pants, the ones with the holes Sienna keeps trying to throw away, were already soaked through. I'd stopped carrying around Minute 3. When you're in problem-solving mode, there's no room for vanity, and I learned a long time ago that worrying about your outfit while fixing something broken is just a waste of mental energy. The landlord had texted at 5:47 a.m. because infrastructure emergencies don't respect the concept of sleep. He said a plumber was on the way and should be there by 6:30, but he didn't give me a name or a phone number. There wasn't even a confirmation that the guy wouldn't just assume the problem solved itself and leave, which is exactly how these things usually go. Someone calls it in, someone vaguely agrees to show up, and nothing actually gets fixed because nobody wants to deal with the mess. So here I was. Ember. I'm an infrastructure consultant by day and a wet pajama enthusiast by dawn, kneeling beside a pipe that was basically a slow-motion disaster waiting for the right moment to explode. I'd already mapped out the fix in my head. The joint was corroded, which isn't surprising in a building this old, and the copper had oxidized until it looked like a museum exhibit for industrial failure. The real culprit was the water pressure from the upper floors. There was too much force with nowhere healthy for it to go, so the pipes were essentially being bullied into submission. I grew up in a house that was always falling apart, and my dad called me his human tool belt by the time I was 12. Since we never had money for professionals, I learned early on that most problems look a lot less scary when you actually look at them instead of hiding. I pulled out my phone to take measurements while muttering to myself about copper versus PVC. It felt like a normal Saturday morning, even though I looked like a drowned rat in a basement that smelled like rust and regret. The air down here was thick and heavy, the kind of dead air that makes you breathe harder just to get enough oxygen. It felt like it hadn't moved in months, and had probably given up trying. Then I heard the footsteps. They weren't rushed, and they didn't sound like someone worried about being late. These were heavy, deliberate steps that moved through the basement like whoever owned them also owned the building. It sounded like the stairs were just something he was walking across rather than a path he had to navigate. I didn't look up because I was focused on the problem I actually understood. I assumed this was the plumber, some older guy who was tired from early morning calls and just wanted to get the job done. I already knew what I was going to say. I was going to tell him the joint was corroded, and he'd need to cut it right there to replace the whole section. It was simple, direct information that would make the job easier, but I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The basement door swung open, and the air in the room shifted. It wasn't a metaphor. The atmospheric pressure actually changed like someone had moved it with their bare hands. The cold turned into something else. It wasn't uncomfortable anymore, but it felt alive and charged. It was the kind of energy that makes your nervous system sit up and pay attention whether your brain wants it to or not. I looked up, expecting to see work boots and a tired face, but what I saw stopped every thought in my head. He wasn't a plumber. I knew that before he even took a second step. Plumbers don't move with that kind of predatory grace, and they don't wear dark clothes that fit like they were tailored to move perfectly with their body. He had shoulders that were impossibly broad, and his presence made the small basement feel even smaller. He was tall, but it was the kind of height that made me realize how much space he was going to take up just by existing. He had dark hair and sharp features that made me think of words like dangerous and beautiful at the same time. But his eyes were what really stopped me. They were a gold-flecked brown, and they looked like they'd seen things and carried weights that most people never have to consider. His presence filled the laundry room like a storm rolling in. I stood up slowly with water dripping from my clothes, fully aware that I looked like a total disaster. I didn't even care because some part of my brain was having a reaction it couldn't quite put into words. "The joint's corroded," I said, and my voice sounded steadier and more professional than I expected. It was like my training was kicking in, even though my internal system was clearly malfunctioning. "You'll need to cut it here and replace the whole section." He didn't move for a second. He just looked at me like he'd found something he hadn't expected to see in a basement at 6 in the morning. It felt like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve before I could move. Then his eyes went dark and his pupils dilated. I watched his hands clench into fists like he was holding back something massive that was fighting to get out. A question started burning in my mind, and it was impossible to ignore. Who is this man, and why does every part of me feel like it's recognizing him? 3 months ago, I didn't know what an infrastructure consultant did either, so I understand why people look bored when I tell them my job title. Basically, I walk into old buildings and look at them the way a doctor looks at an X-ray. I don't see the surface. I see what's breaking underneath, what's corroded, and what's about to fail because nobody bothered to look too closely. I got this job in the city because my portfolio was solid, but mostly it was because I grew up in a house held together by duct tape and prayer. You learn to see structural problems the way other people see dust. My dad always said I had the eye, but I think he just meant I was too stubborn to leave things broken. Moving here was supposed to be my fresh start with a new job and an apartment with a roommate who actually paid rent on time. That roommate was Sienna, and she was the only reason this move made any sense. We lived together in college, and our friendship survived because we were too integrated to ever really separate. She was the chaos to my order, always wanting to do the things people said not to do, while I was busy thinking through the consequences. She was already thriving in a marketing job here, and she'd spent months texting me to come join her. I resisted at first, because I'm not an impulsive person. I'm the type who makes spreadsheets about my feelings and thinks in terms of timelines and contingencies. But then the job offer came through, and Sienna sent me a video of an available apartment. So I said yes, before my brain could talk me out of it. The apartment was in an older building that Sienna called charming and rent-controlled. She promised it had good bones, which in my professional opinion meant the foundation was definitely a problem, just not one that belonged to us yet. The building was 5 stories of pre-war construction with exposed brick and high ceilings. It was romantic if you liked history, but it was terrifying if you worked in infrastructure and could see the slow-motion disaster hiding in the walls. The pipes groaned constantly, and the water pressure fluctuated like it was having a mood swing. The basement always smelled like rust, resignation, and old concrete. But the rent was cheap, and Sienna was there, so I committed to the decision. I'd been in the apartment for 2 weeks when the landlord stopped returning my calls, and by month 3, I'd stopped expecting him to answer at all. He was the kind of landlord who existed in theory, but not in practice. That meant when something broke, it stayed broken until you fixed it yourself or learned to live with the damage. Sienna tried to convince me to just ignore the problems like a normal person, but normal people don't look at a structural failure and think it's someone else's problem. When the dripping started, I noticed it immediately. When it got faster, I paid attention, and when it turned into a steady stream at 5 in the morning, I finally got out of bed. I woke up at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of water hitting concrete. It wasn't a gentle drip that we could monitor. It was the sound of something in the walls, giving up and telling me about it very loudly. I padded downstairs in the dark, with my mind already in problem-solving mode. The basement was hit by that specific, bone-deep cold that belongs to underground spaces everywhere. The main junction was exactly where I expected it to be, and the water was pooling exactly where it shouldn't. I grabbed every towel we owned and texted the landlord with photos and a description so detailed he couldn't pretend he didn't understand the emergency. Then I just waited. He texted back 4 minutes later saying a plumber was on the way and should be there by 6:30. He didn't give me a name or any confirmation of an actual appointment. It was just a vague promise of a man in the system who would allegedly show up in the next 43 minutes. I changed into my crisis outfit, which consisted of yoga pants and an oversized sweater that had seen better days. I put on fuzzy socks because the basement was freezing, and I wore those pajama pants with the holes in the pockets because they were already soaked from the floor. I'd given up on saving them. That's what I was wearing when my life took a turn that no degree in infrastructure could have ever prepared me for. I was still kneeling by the pipe, when the minutes started stretching into something that felt intentional, like the house itself was testing my patience. The water had finally slowed to a manageable drip once I loosened the pressure valve, which was a temporary fix rather than a real solution. But temporary was all I could manage at 6 in the morning. My towels were already soaked through and heavy with cold water, so I resigned myself to the fact that this basement would smell like mildew for a week, regardless of who showed up to help. The cold felt deeper now, moving past the surface chill of the morning to that biting dampness that settles into concrete floors and waits to fight any warmth that dares to enter. My knees had gone numb against the hard ground, and my pajama pants were plastered to my skin in a way that should have bothered me. Sienna would have cared, since she always insisted on looking put together for service calls, but I learned a long time ago that worrying about your hair while you're in problem-solving mode just keeps you from actually fixing the leak. This wasn't complicated work anyway. It was just an assessment. I pulled out my phone to check my notes app, which was already 2 pages deep with specific observations about the failing infrastructure. The water pressure was inconsistent, the joints showed visible corrosion, and the age of the building suggested the original copper plumbing was still hiding behind these walls. That specific joint wasn't just leaking, it was failing entirely, with copper that had oxidized until the metal looked almost crystalline and decorative. This decay had likely been happening for months, but because the building was old, nobody had bothered to update the pipes, meaning every tenant here was betting their morning shower on a system that had already given up. I grew up around pipes exactly like these because my dad's house was held together by stubbornness and the determination that comes from not having money for professionals. I learned to fix things because doing it myself was the only way to keep the lights on and the water running. By the time I was 12, I could replace a basic valve, and by 16, I'd rerouted an entire section of galvanized steel in our basement because it was cheaper to sweat the joints myself than to let the water bill spike. Most people learn to call for help when a pipe bursts. I learned to pick up a wrench and figure it out. The logic of the situation was clean and easy to follow, so I marked the metal with my thumbnail to show the plumber exactly where the cut needed to happen. Since we were dealing with copper instead of PVC, we would need a pipe cutter, some sealant, and a fresh joint to get the system back online. The whole job would take an hour if the guy knew his craft, though the real issue was the pressure coming from the floors above us. That was a systems failure rather than a simple pipe leak, but that kind of thinking was beyond the scope of an emergency repair. I checked my watch and saw it was 6:14 a.m., which meant the plumber should be arriving within the next 15 minutes if the landlord's vague message was actually true. Usually, a promise like, on the way, really means the guy will appear sometime in the next 4 hours if you're lucky. That's just how these things go. Someone makes a promise, time passes, and you either fix the disaster yourself or learn to live with the damage. The basement stayed quiet except for the rhythmic dripping, creating that heavy, waiting silence that makes it feel like the foundation is holding its breath. I've never been comfortable in these underground spaces because they feel like a building's unconscious mind where all the ugly infrastructure is hidden away. This is where the slow motion failures happen, the ones nobody wants to acknowledge until the floor is underwater. But the problem here was visible, and the solution was perfectly logical. There are no emotional complications with a corroded pipe because it doesn't judge you or care what you think. It just needs to be fixed, and fixing things is the one thing I've always been good at. I heard the footsteps before the door even moved. They were heavy and confident, not rushed or cautious, belonging to someone who moved through the world like they owned every square inch of it. I didn't look up immediately because I was focused on my measurements and the reality of the copper in front of me. The basement door creaked open, and the footsteps stopped dead. I'd already planned exactly what to say while I was waiting for the minutes to tick by. I was going to tell him the joint was corroded, show him the cut line, and mention the pressure issues from the upper floors. Service people usually like it when you've done half the thinking for them, so I kept my head down to finish marking the line with my pen. Then, the silence got heavy. It wasn't the normal basement quiet anymore. It was a different kind of stillness that happens when the air recognizes a person before your brain can process their presence. I finally looked up. Every word I'd prepared to say simply evaporated. He wasn't a plumber. I knew that before he even took a second step into the laundry room because the plumbers don't move with that kind of predatory grace. He occupied the space like he was claiming it, wearing dark clothes that looked tailored to a body that didn't belong in a basement. The fabric seemed to understand its only job was to move with him, clinging to the kind of density that made the room feel suddenly cramped. He was tall, but not in a way that felt normal. He was the kind of tall that made the ceiling feel lower and the walls feel like they were closing in. I became painfully aware that I was still on my knees, soaked and shivering, looking up at a man who defied every category of service professional I'd ever known. He had dark hair and features so sharp they made me think of danger and beauty in the same breath, which made no sense, yet I couldn't stop the thought. His shoulders were broad enough that he'd likely have to turn sideways to get back out the door, and the corded muscle in his forearms suggested he was built for much more than simple repairs. But it was his eyes that actually stopped my heart. Even in the dim light of the laundry room, I could see the gold-flecked brown staring back at me. They were the eyes of someone who had made impossible decisions and carried weights most people couldn't imagine. He looked at me and actually saw me, registering my presence as something more than just an obstacle in his way. Then the scent hit me and my logic went out the window. It wasn't cologne or aftershave, it was something sharp and intoxicating, like spiced rum mixed with cold rain and deep cedarwood. The smell bypassed my brain and slammed straight into my primitive system, making my knees feel less stable than the concrete floor beneath them. My breath caught in my throat without my permission, and for a second, I forgot how to exhale. The air in the basement shifted as if the atmospheric pressure had dropped, making the cold feel alive and electric. It was the kind of charge that makes your nervous system scream for attention, regardless of what your rational mind is trying to tell you. I stood up slowly, watching the water drip from my ruined pajama pants and feeling like a total disaster. I was wet, disheveled, and trapped in a basement at 6 a.m, but I couldn't find it in me to care because my body was reacting to him in a way I couldn't explain. "The joint's corroded," I said, and I was shocked that my voice sounded so steady and professional. I told him he'd need to cut the pipe and replace the section, clinging to my training like an anchor in a storm. His silence was absolute and heavy. He didn't move a muscle. He just stood there and really looked at me, like I was a puzzle he hadn't expected to find in the dark. He seemed to be trying to solve me before I could move again, his gaze traveling over me with a terrifying intensity. I watched his hands clench into fists, the corded muscle in his arms tightening as if he were holding back something massive and violent. His eyes went darker as his pupils dilated, and the gold flecks seemed to disappear into the blackness of his stare. "You know what you're doing," he stated, and it wasn't a question so much as a low-pitched accusation. His voice was a deep, subterranean rumble that vibrated in my chest, plucking at a string inside me that I didn't even know existed until that moment. I was still clutching a wrench, a detail that suddenly felt ridiculous and vital all at once. I was standing there in wet clothes with my hair in a messy knot, yet he was looking at me like I'd just performed a miracle. "I fixed worse than this," I replied, because professionalism was the only thing keeping me upright. I tried to focus on the water pressure from above, hoping to steer the conversation back to something that didn't make my skin flush. Something flickered across his face, maybe recognition or a flash of frustration, as if I'd said something important without realizing the weight of my own words. He moved closer. It wasn't an aggressive move, but it was the kind of motion that belonged to someone who never had to ask for permission to be anywhere. He kneeled down beside the pipe, and the small space between us suddenly became a living, breathing thing. I could feel the heat radiating off his body even though we weren't touching, and the freezing basement suddenly felt like it was burning up. My entire world narrowed down to the proximity of his shoulder and the way his body seemed to respond to mine, creating a tension I didn't have a name for. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered, his voice dropping into a register that made my pulse spike. I let out a short laugh because I thought he was talking about the laundry room. "Yeah, well, neither are you, apparently," I shot back, trying to regain some ground. The air shifted again, and the pressure dropped so sharply it felt like the world was tilting on its axis. He turned his head until we were only inches apart, close enough that I could see the gold in his eyes and the sharp, clenched line of his jaw. His breathing was deliberate and controlled, like he was using every ounce of his will to keep himself from snapping. "What's your name?" he asked, and the question felt much more important than a simple introduction. "Ember," I whispered back, watching his lips move as he repeated the name to himself, tasting the syllables as if they meant something. "I'm Colby," he said, and the name landed with a weight that shook me to my core. Something deep in my bones recognized that name, even though we were complete strangers. Something deep in my marrow recognized that name before my brain could even process the syllables. It wasn't a logical connection or a memory I could pin down, but something much lower, something primal and physical that hummed through my nervous system. It's that specific jolt of recognition that hits your gut seconds before your mind catches up to explain why your heart is suddenly hammering against your ribs. He repeated my name as if he were testing the weight of it, tasting the vowels and claiming the whole word all at once. Ember. He didn't say it like a question, but rather a heavy statement of fact that hung in the humid air. The way the sound vibrated out of him made it feel like a warning, and a promise wrapped into one, as if those two concepts were exactly the same thing in his world. "That's a name, Swallets," I managed to choke out, and I immediately wanted to sink into the floor because of how incredibly stupid I sounded. But he didn't seem to notice the awkwardness, instead looking at me like I'd just done something miraculous by simply breathing, and my brain was struggling to function under the sheer pressure of his proximity. I could feel the atmospheric shift every time he looked at my face, and the way his breathing hitched made the small space feel even tighter than it already was. "It suits you," he murmured, and for a split second, I caught a flash of something that looked almost like vulnerability in his expression. It was as if, admitting that small observation cost him a piece of his composure, he wasn't ready to give up yet. We stayed frozen like that for a long beat, just inches apart while the air between us became saturated with an electric, heavy sense of the inevitable. His hand remained dangerously close to mine on the cold metal of the wrench, and I could feel the radiant heat coming off his skin. He possessed a terrifying, enticing density of muscle that made me think of heavy machinery and raw power, and honestly, I was struggling to focus on anything else. "We should probably get back to this," I said, though my voice didn't sound like mine anymore, coming out breathless and thin. I sounded like a stranger to myself, someone uncertain and off balance, which was a far cry from the woman who usually had everything under control. He didn't move an inch, and neither did I, as if we were both caught in the same magnetic trap. Instead of pulling away, his hand shifted just a fraction of an inch until his fingers brushed against mine on the tool. It was the lightest contact imaginable, yet it sent a surge of electricity straight through my palm like I'd accidentally grabbed a live wire. That skin-to-skin contact felt like a silent conversation where something ancient in me recognized a matching frequency in him resonating at a level far below conscious thought. "You don't seem scared," he noted, his voice dropping into a low rumble that felt like he was testing the waters to see if I knew the fire I was playing with. He was checking to see if I understood the weight of what I was allowing to happen in this cramped basement. "Should I be?" I asked, and the question was genuine because there was no denying the danger rolling off him in waves. It was written in the way he held his massive frame and the way he controlled every tiny movement with lethal precision, but even with that threat looming over me, I felt a strange sense of safety the closer he got, which made zero sense, and yet I couldn't stop myself from leaning into it. He reached past me to grab something from the floor, and the corded muscle of his forearm brushed firmly against my waist. It didn't feel like an accident, but it wasn't quite a deliberate grab either. It was just close enough that the contact vibrated through me like a lightning strike finding ground. The scent of him intensified in that moment. Sharp spiced rum, cold rain, and deep cedar wood, and it made my thoughts scatter like birds flushed from a thicket. We worked in a heavy silence for a minute while the pipe continued to drip and water pooled around our boots. Neither of us actually moved to fix the leak, and even though the wrench was still in my grip, I wasn't using it for anything productive. I was just clutching it like a prop, a desperate attempt to ground myself in the reality that I was in a laundry room with a plumbing problem and not in some fever dream. "You're good at this," he said, but it didn't land like a standard compliment or polite small talk. It was a blunt observation, a statement of fact he was sharing with me as if he were cataloging my traits. At fixing pipes? I asked, trying my best to sound casual while praying he didn't notice the way my hands were visibly shaking. I was doing everything in my power to pretend I wasn't affected by him, but the way he watched me made it clear I wasn't fooling anyone. At not being intimidated, he clarified, and I heard a distinct note of relief in his tone that caught me off guard. It was as if my refusal to flinch meant something significant to him, like he was used to people seeing the power he carried and immediately backing away. There's not a lot that intimidates me, I lied, because the truth was that he absolutely terrified me in the best possible way. The way he could change the pressure in a room just by standing there, and the way he looked at me like I was the only thing on the planet mattered more than I wanted to admit. My body was responding to him without asking for any permission from my brain, and that loss of control was the most intimidating thing of all. People are usually scared of things they don't understand, but I understand how pipes work. His lips curved into the ghost of a smile. You understand a lot more than that. The moment stretched out between us until I realized I'd completely forgotten to breathe. His hand was still hovering right next to mine, so close that I could feel the heat radiating off his skin and the barely contained energy in his large frame. His thumb was a hair's breadth away from mine, just vibrating in that agonizing space between a near miss and actual contact. We should probably get back to this, I repeated, hoping that saying it a second time would somehow conjure up the confidence I was missing. My voice was still failing me, sounding breathless and losing ground with every word I spoke. He didn't budge, and his hand stayed exactly where it was, while his breathing remained deliberate and controlled. It felt like he was holding back a landslide with nothing but pure force of will, and the tension was becoming physical. Not here, he said, his voice dropping into a subterranean register that made my toes curl. Not like this. But despite the words, he didn't pull away, and I stayed right where I was, trapped in his orbit. The physical reality was that the pipe sat in a space far too narrow for two people to work with any kind of comfort. It was a cramped, awkward angle that would have made any normal professional tell me to get out of the way so they could finish the job. But he didn't ask for space. Instead, he moved even closer until there wasn't a single inch of air left between us. His shoulder pressed hard against mine as he leaned toward the corroded joint, and the heat coming off him was immediate and staggering. It wasn't just body warmth, but a heavy, radiating intensity that made the damp chill of the basement vanish instantly. As he moved, the scent of spiced rum and rain-soaked cedarwood flooded my senses again, making it impossible to think in straight lines. My thoughts were completely fragmented, reduced to nothing but sensory input and the immediate physical reality of his body against mine. You should go, he said, even as his hand reached out to steady mine while I fumbled for the wrench. His fingers wrapped around my wrist, and the contact was like a physical shock that bypassed my logic and slammed straight into my primitive brain. His grip was firm and grounding, not rough, but it carried enough weight to make it clear that he was the one in control of this interaction. I didn't even try to pull away, mostly because I wasn't sure my legs would actually support me if I broke contact. I live here? I reminded him, as if that simple fact explained why I was huddled in a dark laundry room with a man who felt like a beautiful disaster. It was a weak excuse to justify why I was staying in a space where danger and safety were colliding so violently. He let out a slow, ragged exhale like he was fighting a war with his own self-restraint. His jaw tightened until the corded muscle in his neck stood out in sharp relief, and I watched him struggle to pull his composure back over himself like a heavy shroud. Not here, he repeated, his voice sounding rougher and more strained than before. Not in this room. Not with me. Even as he said it, his hand didn't let go of my wrist, and his grip actually tightened just enough to anchor me to him. It was a silent admission that while he was telling me to leave, he desperately wanted me to stay right where I was. The air was so thick with tension, it felt like the entire basement was about to ignite, as if the universe had been waiting for this exact moment to finally snap into place. I finally forced myself to look him directly in the eyes, and it felt like staring straight into a solar eclipse. It was the kind of intensity that makes you want to look away for your own safety, yet you can't stop yourself from seeking out the light, His eyes had gone almost entirely dark, the pupils blown wide until the gold flecks were nearly gone, and his breathing had become jagged and uneven. Every muscle in his massive frame was coiled like a high-tension spring, as if he were holding himself together through sheer pride and the knowledge that he was on the verge of doing something he couldn't take back. "Why?" I whispered, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone far more vulnerable and uncertain than the woman I usually was. He leaned in until I could feel the heat of his breath against my ear, a deliberate move that made my skin prickle. Everything he did felt like a calculated choice, and right now, he was choosing to stay in my space and see exactly how far this would go. "Because if you stay," he said, and the vibration of his voice traveled through my entire body, "I'm going to do something we're both going to regret." My body didn't wait for my brain to weigh the pros and cons before it reacted. My pulse went into overdrive, and a flush of heat climbed up my neck, every nerve ending suddenly screaming that this was a turning point. I was standing on a threshold, and I knew with terrifying clarity that whatever happened in the next few seconds would change the trajectory of my entire life. I knew I should leave, and the rational, logical part of my mind was currently screaming at me to run for the stairs. That part of my brain was busy listing all the complications and the fact that I didn't even know this man's last name, let alone what he was doing in my house. Instead, I looked at him and asked, "What if I don't want to regret it?" The sound that came out of him was barely human, a low, guttural growl that shook the small room as if he'd finally snapped the leash on his restraint. His free hand came up to cup my face, and his thumb traced my cheekbone with a gentleness that was almost more overwhelming than his strength. It was a startling contrast that made me realize he could probably crush anything he touched. Yet, he was choosing to be soft with me. "You have no idea what you're asking for," he rasped against my skin. "Then explain it to me," I challenged him, and I meant every word of it. I wasn't thinking about the leaking pipe or being a professional or keeping a safe distance anymore. All I could think about was the way his eyes had gone dark and the way his body felt like a live wire, and I realized I was the only thing standing between him and his self-control. He pulled back just a fraction, and the loss of that physical closeness felt like a physical ache, as if the temperature in the room had suddenly plummeted. His hand stayed on my face, his thumb still moving against my skin, but the tiny bit of distance felt like a canyon between us. "Not like this," he said, his voice thick with the effort it took to speak. "Not in a laundry room, and not when you don't even know who I really am." I opened my mouth to ask what he meant by that, ready to demand some kind of answer, when the sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs cut through the silence. Sienna's voice drifted down into the basement. "Hey, is the plumber down there?" We jumped apart instantly, the spell breaking so fast it left me dizzy and disoriented. I was suddenly painfully aware of how I must look, wearing soaked pajama pants with my hair falling out of a messy knot and my face flushed bright red. I looked exactly like a woman who had been seconds away from kissing a total stranger in her basement at 6 a.m. Colby stood up, and I watched his entire personality shift as if he were flipping a series of internal switches. His shoulders squared, his expression turned to stone, and his presence seemed to expand until he filled every corner of the room without even moving. He wasn't the man who had been hovering over me a second ago. He was something else entirely, someone much more dangerous and much further away. Sienna appeared at the base of the stairs with her phone clutched in her hand, her expression carefully arranged as if she'd been bracing for this exact arrival. She was fully dressed for the occasion in a way that felt intentional, sporting a coordinated outfit and the specific sweater that always made the green in her eyes pop. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless, giving off a polished energy that usually only surfaced when she was expecting someone of high status. I might have found this sudden transformation funny if the air in the basement wasn't currently vibrating with a heavy, unspoken electricity. The second her eyes landed on him, every drop of color drained from her face. It wasn't a slow fade. It was an instant, total washout, as if a literal switch had been flipped and her blood had decided to retreat somewhere safer. She actually recoiled a step, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her phone like it was the only anchor left in a world that had just tilted on its axis. "Your Majesty," she breathed, and the title hung in the damp air like a heavy confession she'd been hiding from me. It was the sound of a secret finally breaking, making it clear that this entire morning had been a choreographed play where I was the only actor who hadn't seen the script. I looked from her pale face to his hard expression, my brain struggling to bridge the gap. What? Colby's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping under his skin as the sharp line of his profile became even more predatory. You didn't tell her. He didn't ask it. He stated it with a grim certainty that suggested he'd already mapped out this exact disaster in his head. He looked like a man who had walked into a trap he'd seen coming miles away and was now just confirming the final details. Sienna's voice dropped to a frantic, tiny whisper. I didn't think you'd actually come yourself. I thought you'd just send someone from your... From your what? I cut in, still operating under the delusion that there was a sane, logical reason my roommate was talking to a man in a wet t-shirt like he sat on a throne. Colby turned his gaze back to me, and I watched a flicker of weary resignation settle over his features. He looked like he'd been hoping to avoid this specific conversation, but now that it was here, he was stepping into it with the weight of a man who never ran from a confrontation. Your roommate called the palace, he said, his voice dropping into a low, deliberate rumble that made the floorboards hum. She told my office there was a critical failure in the building's infrastructure. The word palace hit the room like a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. Everything in my head stopped moving for a heartbeat while I tried to process the sheer weight of what that implied. A palace meant royalty, and royalty meant the kind of absolute authority that explained why he moved through this cramped basement like he owned the very air we were breathing. What palace? I asked, though a sinking feeling in my chest told me I already knew the answer. I saw it in the way Sienna was trembling and the way she'd used that title like a prayer she'd practiced in the mirror. Sienna, what palace are we talking about? She winced as if the question physically hurt, looking like she'd been dreading this reveal since the moment she hit the call button. The Royal Palace, Ember. He's the Alpha King. I was just trying to help you, and I thought if I went to the top... I looked at Colby again, and suddenly the entire morning shifted into a terrifyingly sharp focus. It wasn't a gradual realization. It was like a camera lens finally clicking into place to reveal a predator standing right in front of me. The way he carried himself wasn't just confidence. It was the controlled, lethal grace of someone who was used to being the most dangerous person in any room. He didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed because his presence carried the physical weight of actual power. I saw it now in the corded muscle of his arms and the absolute, unshakable certainty in his eyes. You're the Alpha King, I said, the words coming out like a flat accusation of betrayal. It felt like the universe had just played a massive, cruel joke on me without asking for my permission. Yes, Colby replied simply, as if admitting he ruled the entire territory was no more significant than confirming the time of day. He stood there perfectly still, watching me with an intensity that suggested he'd already made peace with whatever my reaction was going to be. And you showed up here to fix a leaky pipe, I said, needing to hear the sheer insanity of the sentence out loud, just to make sure I hadn't lost my mind. No, he said, his eyes locking onto mine with a heat that made my skin prickle. The power was still there, but something raw and surprisingly vulnerable had opened up underneath it. I came because your roommate called, and I wanted to see for myself what kind of person would live in a place this broken. Sienna was still hovering on the stairs, wringing her hands together as she realized she'd unleashed a storm she had no way of controlling. I'm so sorry. I just thought the building is falling apart and I wanted to fix it. Colby didn't even look at her. He just held up one hand, and she went silent instantly. He didn't snap or shout, but the gesture carried such a heavy command that the air itself seemed to go still. It's fine, Sienna. You were trying to look out for your friend, and I understand that. But his focus never wavered from me, narrowing down until I felt like the only person left in the world. He was looking at me like I was a complex equation he was determined to solve. I came because the second I caught your scent, he said, his voice vibrating deep in his chest, every instinct I have recognized you. It was a recognition so deep, it felt like I'd been waiting for this moment my entire life. That word, recognized, seemed to pulse between us in the silence. He didn't say he liked me or that he found me interesting. He said he recognized me, as if our meeting wasn't a coincidence, but a collision that had been written into our DNA. It felt like the universe had finally pressed two jagged puzzle pieces together to see if they would click. "This is completely insane," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I know," Colby agreed, and for the first time there was something almost gentle in his expression. "It's absolutely insane." Sienna started rambling again, her apologies tripping over each other as her anxiety spiked through the roof. "I'm sorry, Ember. I really am. I just knew the plumbing was a disaster and you were killing yourself trying to fix it. And I know the king is always looking for ways to improve the city, so I thought if he saw how much you cared." Colby raised his hand again, cutting her off as effectively as a physical wall. "It's okay, Sienna. Your intentions were good. Now please, go upstairs." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command delivered with such quiet authority that she didn't even hesitate. She looked between us one last time, sensing the thick tension in the air, and then turned to scramble up the wooden steps. The basement door clicked shut, and the sound of her footsteps faded until it was just me, the Alpha King, and the steady, rhythmic drip of water hitting the concrete floor. The moment we were alone, the atmosphere shifted back into that high-voltage state where the air felt too thick to breathe. The silence wasn't empty. It was loaded with everything we hadn't said yet. It felt like the room had shrunk, pulling us into a space where nothing existed outside of the heat radiating between us. "This changes things," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to him or just trying to convince myself. My voice sounded thin and shaky, lacking the usual bite I used when I was dealing with a difficult repair. "This changes everything." "It doesn't have to," Colby countered, but the low vibration in his tone suggested the shift had already happened. He looked like a man who knew the world had changed and was now just waiting for me to catch up. "It only changes what we allow it to change." "You're the Alpha King," I repeated, as if the title itself was an insurmountable wall. "You can't just negotiate that away. That comes with a life of expectations and protocols and massive responsibilities." I looked down at my soaked pajama pants and gestured at the grimy walls around us. "And then there's me. I'm a girl who meets people by handing them tools in a flooded basement at dawn. I needed to move, to put some physical distance between us so I could actually think without my brain being scrambled by his proximity." I stood up and backed away, trying to find a spot in the room where his gravity didn't feel so overwhelming. "I don't even know you," I argued, my voice gaining a little more strength. "And you definitely don't know me. You've seen me covered in gray water, and you know I can handle a pipe wrench, but that isn't the same as actually knowing a person." "I know exactly who you are," Colby said, and he began to close the gap I just created. He didn't rush, but his movement was inevitable, like a tide coming in that I had no hope of stopping. "You're capable and fierce. You don't bow down to titles, and you solve your own problems instead of waiting for a savior to show up." "You're a king," I said again, the word feeling heavy and ridiculous in my mouth. "I don't know the first thing about your world or how to act in a palace. I'm not built for whatever that life requires." "And yet, you handed me a wrench like I was just another man," Colby said, and I heard a flicker of something like genuine wonder in his voice. It was as if that simple act, treating him like a human being instead of a monument, was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him. Most people probably saw the crown and the power and kept their distance, but I just put him to work. He reached out, his fingers grazing my jawline with a touch that sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to my core. His thumb traced the line of my cheekbone, slow and agonizingly deliberate, and I forgot how to draw a full breath. "This is too complicated," I whispered, though I didn't pull away from his hand. Every logical part of my brain was screaming at me to run, to find a safe distance and think this through, but my body was already surrendering to the heat of him. "It is complicated," Colby agreed, his thumb still moving against my skin. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, letting the fear finally show in my voice. I was terrified of what this meant and the life I would have to leave behind to even try. I don't know if I can be what you need. He stepped even closer until his massive frame was looming over me, his hands coming up to cup my face. He held me with a surprising tenderness, as if he knew I was on the verge of bolting and was trying to anchor me to the spot. Then we won't worry about the future yet, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. We'll just start with the truth. What truth? I asked, my heart thumping against my ribs. Tell me you don't feel this, he challenged, leaning down until his forehead was resting against mine. Tell me this is just a coincidence or some random spark of chemistry. Tell me you don't feel that same recognition I do. I couldn't say it. The lie would have died in my throat because the truth was written in the way my pulse was racing and the way my entire nervous system had hummed to life the moment he walked into the room. Feeling it doesn't mean it's possible, I whispered against his lips. Then let me show you why it is, he murmured, and he leaned in the rest of the way. I knew I should have stopped him. I knew this was the moment to walk away and protect myself from the chaos that was about to follow, but I didn't move. His lips met mine with a force that wasn't gentle, and there was absolutely nothing tentative about the way he claimed my mouth. This wasn't the kind of kiss that politely asked for permission or gave me a single second to process the world around me. It felt like he'd been vibrating with anticipation since the moment he stepped down those basement stairs, as if every heartbeat before this had been a grueling exercise in restraint and the careful management of something massive. His hand slid to the back of my neck to anchor me, pulling me flush against him with a grip that was firm without ever crossing into rough. There was just enough pressure to make it clear that he was the one deciding what happened next, and what he'd decided was this, his mouth devouring mine while his entire body communicated a primal need I didn't have words for yet. The corroded muscle of his chest felt like granite against my palms, and I realized I'd flattened my hands there without making a conscious choice to move. It was as if my body understood the gravity of the situation long before my brain caught up, and I could feel his heartbeat thudding fast and irregular against my skin. Every muscle in his frame was coiled and ready, holding back a flood of intensity with nothing but pure, staggering force of will. He tasted like something dark and intoxicating, a sensory collision of spiced rum and deep cedarwood that bypassed my logic and slammed straight into my primitive brain. My knees went weak as my thoughts scattered into the humid air, and while I should have felt like I was losing control, I actually felt like I was finally touching something real. When he eventually pulled back just an inch, his breathing was ragged and heavy. He rested his forehead against mine, and I could feel the physical effort it took for him to maintain that tiny bit of distance instead of consuming me entirely. That, he rasped against my lips, his voice a deep subterranean rumble that vibrated through my own chest, is what's possible. I was trembling so hard I hated it, especially because I knew he could feel the vibration, yet he didn't say a word about my body betraying my composure. He simply pulled me closer, tucking me into the heat of his frame as if my fear was just another weight he was perfectly willing to carry for me. This is insane, I whispered into the space between us. Yes, Colby agreed. And then he kissed me again, only this time the sensation went even deeper. This second kiss changed everything because it wasn't softer. It was more demanding. His other hand found my waist and hauled me against him until the atmospheric pressure dropped and there was no space left for air. I could feel the terrifying density of his muscle and the way he was fighting himself, his entire body tight with a restraint that looked like it was costing him everything he had. It really should have terrified me to feel that much power held on such a short leash. Instead, the tension made me want to push him further just to see what would happen if he finally stopped holding back. When he finally broke the contact, it felt like someone had cut the power and the heat in the room at the exact same time. He kept his forehead pressed to mine, his breath coming in heavy, jagged hitches that echoed in the quiet basement. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice sounding rough and unpolished. My heart rate spiked instantly. What is it? The bond we're creating right now isn't just a physical reaction, he said, pausing as if he had to choose each word with extreme caution. In my world, when an alpha finds their mate, a visceral recognition happens that goes much deeper than simple attraction. I pulled back just enough to catch his gaze. Are you trying to say, I'm saying that what I'm feeling right now isn't some new spark, he said, and the certainty in his eyes was absolute. It's recognition and inevitability. The exact moment you've been waiting for your whole life without even realizing you were waiting for it. Every logical instinct I possessed told me I should run and find some distance so I could think about this rationally. But I was already falling, and we both knew it. I don't believe in fate, I told him, trying to find my footing. Neither did I, Colby responded, his hand coming up to cup my face with surprising tenderness. But I believe in this, and more importantly, I believe in you. You don't even know me, I argued, clinging to the most logical thing I could articulate in the moment. I know you better than I've known anyone in years, he said, with a conviction that silenced my protests. You're brave and competent, and you don't bow to authority just because someone has a title, which means you see me as a person rather than a position of power. His thumb traced the line of my lower lip, making my breath catch in my throat. This is all moving way too fast, I whispered, even though I made no move to pull away from his touch. Then we'll slow down, Colby promised, and he kissed me again, but this time it was soft and lingering. It was almost worse than the intensity because the gentleness felt vulnerable, like this restraint was costing him more than the passion ever could. When we finally broke apart for good, I was breathless and exhilarated, my entire system vibrating at a frequency I couldn't quite name. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely a breath. He pulled me against his chest so I could hear the rhythmic thud of his heart and feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The basement was freezing, but I was radiating heat, and even though water was still pooling around the pipes, neither of us seemed to care. The world outside this small, damp room simply didn't exist anymore. There was only the sound of his heartbeat against my ear and the heavy weight of his arms around me, marking the start of something I didn't choose, but definitely couldn't deny. Now, Colby said, his voice vibrating through his ribs and into mine, we figure this out together. We're still standing in the laundry room, but the broken pipe has become completely irrelevant to the situation. The water has either stopped dripping or I've just tuned it out, and right now I'm existing in a space where my brain has decided to ignore everything that isn't Colby. He sits on the edge of the washing machine like it's a throne he's just claimed, his breathing still rough as his composure slowly settles back into place. I lean against the opposite wall because I need something solid at my back, mostly because my knees aren't exactly reliable after what just happened. The basement has gone quiet, possessing that heavy, waiting silence that happens right after the world shifts on its axis. Tell me about your world, I say, and I'm surprised that my voice sounds steadier than I actually feel. If I'm going to make sense of this, I need to understand where you actually come from. He takes a long beat, looking like he's trying to decide which part of his reality matters the most. When he finally starts speaking, his voice carries the weight of a man explaining a fundamental truth to the only person who has ever truly mattered. There are packs, he explained simply, and we have systems of hierarchy based on what we call designations. Alpha, beta, and omega aren't things you learn. They're biological markers you're born with. Your scent carries it, and your biology responds to specific frequencies, which is why other alphas recognize me the second I walk into a room. I'm listening to him, but the whole thing sounds like a fever dream. And I'm, what, an omega in this system? You're a null, he says, and a look of genuine wonder shifts across his face. Your designation isn't typical because your biology doesn't respond to pheromonal manipulation, which means you see the world differently because the usual hierarchies just don't work on you. That actually makes a strange kind of sense. So I'm basically immune to whatever power trip you have going on. In a way, Colby admits, but you aren't immune to the recognition of the bond. When an alpha meets their true mate, there's a moment where your mind and body scream that this is the person you've been searching for. He leans forward, resting his elbows on his knees to get closer to me. I've met thousands of people over the years, and not once did my system activate like this until I walked down those stairs and caught your scent. The word recognition hangs in the air between us, and I'm starting to realize it isn't just a poetic metaphor for him. It's a physical, cellular reality that exists whether I give him my consent or not. Consent? What does it actually mean? I ask, unable to hide the flicker of fear in my voice. If I accept this, what am I actually agreeing to do with my life? He stays quiet for a moment, weighing the gravity of the question. It means you'd be tied to my world and responsibilities you never asked for, facing constant scrutiny from people judging if you're worthy of standing beside the Alpha King. You'd have to give up your quiet, anonymous life and accept that you'll never be just another face in the crowd again. His eyes lock onto mine, intense and unblinking. But it also means I will spend every single day making sure you know you're valued, providing a level of protection and belonging that most people never get to experience. And if I say no, I ask, because I absolutely have to know what happens if I choose to walk away. Then I'll respect that choice, Colby says, though the words clearly cost him a great deal of pain. But I won't stop wanting you or recognizing you as mine, because the bond works on biological truth rather than simple consent. I look at him, really look at him, and I see the raw vulnerability hidden beneath all that power. He's the Alpha King, yet he's visibly terrified that I'll decide a normal life is worth more than the connection we just shared. This is a lot to take in, I admit. It is, Colby agrees, his voice devoid of any judgment. I need some time, I tell him. I need to process what I'm even considering here before I can give you an answer. He nods, accepting my terms, even though I can see the delay is eating at him. How much time do you need? I don't know yet, I say, gesturing vaguely at the heavy atmosphere between us. This is just a lot. I'll give you all the time you need, Colby says, reaching out to let his fingers brush against my wrist for just a second. But I'm not going anywhere, because this doesn't end when we leave this basement. It's only the beginning. He stands up, and his massive presence immediately fills the small room again with that undeniable weight of authority. What I notice now, though, is the incredible care beneath the surface and the way he's holding himself back from pushing me into a decision. Come on, he says, extending a hand toward me. Let's get you out of those wet pajama pants. I actually laugh, and the sound finally breaks the suffocating tension. That's definitely not a line I expected to hear from royalty. His lips curve into a look of genuine warmth. I contain multitudes, I promise. We climb the stairs together as the basement fades into the shadows behind us, but everything feels different now. The world has shifted into a brand new configuration, and I have a feeling it's never going back to the way it was before. I don't know what's coming next, but for the first time, I'm not planning to run from it. The next morning, Colby shows up at the apartment with coffee and bagels, like it's the most natural thing in the world for the Alpha King to be standing in my kitchen at 7 a.m. Sienna nearly combusts the second she sees him. She actually drops her phone, which is notable because Sienna is the most coordinated, put-together person I know. Apparently, standing in the physical presence of actual royalty rewires the nervous system in ways logic can't explain. I'm so sorry, she keeps stammering, acting like she's personally responsible for the state of the world. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to help. I thought if you saw the infrastructure problem yourself. Colby sets the coffee on the counter with a careful precision that suggests he's managing a massive amount of internal energy. You were looking out for your friend, Sienna, and that's admirable. There's something about the way he says her name that makes it clear he isn't angry, but his attention keeps drifting back to me with a heavy, magnetic pull. It's obvious he's waiting for her to leave the room so the air can finally clear. She gets the message eventually and retreats to her bedroom, leaving me and Colby alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the scent of roasted beans and the weight of the last 18 hours. You didn't have to come back, I say, though my hands are already reaching for the cup he's holding out. It's the perfect temperature with the exact amount of cream I like. He somehow knows my coffee order, despite me never saying a word about it. Yes, I did, Colby says simply, his voice a low rumble that feels non-negotiable. I told you I wasn't going anywhere. The problem is that over the next few days, he really doesn't go anywhere. He shows up constantly, bringing food and fixing every little thing that's broken, from the leaky kitchen sink to the bathroom cabinet and the front door that never closed right. He finds every possible excuse to be near me while I'm trying to process how my life just shifted into an entirely different configuration. It's overwhelming and exactly what I need, which is the real problem. By day 3, the media finds out. I don't know if someone at the palace leaked it or if Sienna's friends talked, but the universe clearly decided that keeping a secret about the Alpha King was no longer on the agenda. The first sign is the wall of photographers outside the building. It's not just one person. It's a gauntlet of long lenses and people staring at their phones with a focused intensity that makes my skin crawl. "This is a problem," I mutter to Colby, who is currently taking up space on my couch like he's lived there for years. "It's inevitable," he answers calmly, acting as if having the paparazzi lay siege to my apartment is just a standard part of the royal dating experience. The newspapers start calling me the Alpha King's mysterious companion, and suddenly there are actual think pieces analyzing my background and whether I'm suitable for the crown. One editorial calls me a breath of fresh air, while another wonders if I'm just a distraction from his royal duties. A third outlet runs a photo of us walking through the city, our hands locked together, with a caption that asks if this is fated or fabricated. Sienna keeps bringing me the morning papers, like I actually want to read what strangers think about my private life. I'm the one living it, and I really don't need a running commentary from people who have never met me. "Your people don't know me," I tell Colby one evening after Sienna has conveniently disappeared to give us some space. "I don't know your world, and now everyone thinks that you're important to me," Colby finishes, moving into my space until the air feels thick. His hand finds mine, his skin warm and rough. "Because you are." "This isn't fair," I argue, and I mean it. "You're asking me to accept fate when I've spent my whole life relying on logic, and that means giving up my privacy and my ability to just be a regular person." "No," Colby says, his voice gentle but firm as he steps closer. "I'm asking you to understand that you were never going to stay anonymous after you walked into that laundry room and handed me a wrench. The moment you treated me like a human being instead of a title was the moment your life changed. And I'm just the one who was there when it happened." He pulls me in, his hand cupping my face while his thumb traces the line of my cheekbone. "Let me show you my world, not as a king, but as the man who went into a basement and found the one thing he didn't know he was looking for." "One visit," I say, feeling my resolve start to crumble under the heat of his gaze. That's all I'm agreeing to. The smile that spreads across his face is devastating, and when he kisses me, it feels like a promise of a beginning. Later that night, I lie awake in the quiet apartment, still able to smell the spiced rum and cedarwood on my skin. Sienna knocks and slips inside, sitting on the edge of my bed just like we used to do when we were kids. "Are you okay?" she asks softly. "I'm terrified," I admit, because the truth is that I can feel how real this is becoming. "What if it is real?" Sienna asks. "What if this is actually your story?" I don't have an answer for her yet. All I know is that tomorrow I'm going to the palace, and I've finally stopped questioning the inevitability he keeps talking about. I have no idea if that makes me brave or just incredibly stupid, but it's probably a bit of both. The palace isn't what I expected, mostly because my brain wasn't equipped to handle architecture on this scale. It's grand, with vaulted ceilings and sweeping marble staircases that make you realize why people used to believe in the divine right of kings. But it also feels lived in, with books scattered on expensive side tables and art that feels personal rather than just decorative. Sunlight pours through massive windows, making the place feel more like a home than a cold museum. Colby moves through the halls with a predatory grace, showing me his world room by room. He introduces me to his inner circle first, warriors and advisors who look at me with a mix of curiosity and hard-won respect. I can't tell if they're checking to see if I'll shatter under the pressure or if I'm actually worthy of the man leading them. They don't say much, but their eyes carry the weight of people who know the Alpha King doesn't bring strangers here lightly. A woman named Mara, who looks like she's spent her life training her body to be a weapon, pulls me aside while Colby takes a quick call. "He's never brought anyone here before," Mara says, her voice flat and honest. "Not like this." "Like what?" I ask, even though the answer is already vibrating in my chest. Like she matters, Mara explained simply. Like you aren't just a political move or a strategic alliance, but someone who actually matters to him as a person. That statement sits heavy in my lungs. I'm not just a companion. I'm significant in a way that everyone who knows him can see. It's a comforting thought, but it's also absolutely terrifying. When Colby returns, he places his hand on the small of my back, a casual gesture that feels like he's anchoring me to the floor. He takes me to a private wing that clearly doesn't see many guests, where floor-to-ceiling windows look out over the entire city. This is his sanctuary, the place he goes when the crown gets too heavy and he needs to be alone. We stand at the glass and he moves behind me, his hands resting on my waist. His body heat is unmistakable, and the scent of spiced rum and cold rain is so intense it makes my head swim. I can feel his steady, deliberate breathing against my neck. "What are you thinking, La?" he asks, his deep voice vibrating through his chest and straight into mine. "That this is real," I whisper. "That you're real and this is actually happening." His arms tighten around me just a fraction. "Does that frighten you?" "It terrifies me," I admit, watching the city lights flicker on as the sun goes down. "You're asking me to give up a normal life for something that defies every bit of logic I have." He turns me around to face him, his expression turning serious as his hands find my face again. "I know I'm asking for a lot, but I'm promising you right now that I will spend every single day proving that it's worth it." "How can you know that?" I ask. "You know I can fix a pipe and that I don't care about titles, but you don't really know me." "I know you better than anyone," he says with a certainty that leaves no room for doubt. "I know you're brave and capable, and I know you see the man, not the position of power." He leans down until his forehead is resting against mine, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum. "I know that when you walked into that laundry room, you changed everything for me." He kisses me then, and it's different from before. It's softer and more deliberate, like he's showing me his own vulnerability and asking if I can handle the weight of it. When we finally break apart, he leads me out onto the balcony where the evening air is cool and smells like distant rain. "Come with me," he says, his hand squeezing mine. "Not just to the palace, but to my life and everything I have to offer. I know I should ask for more time or be more logical about the responsibilities I'm taking on. I should think about what I'm giving up and what it means to bind myself to a king. Instead, I just say, okay." The word hangs in the air, and I can feel something fundamental shifting between us. It's an agreement and a surrender to the inevitability he's been talking about since the basement. He pulls me into his arms, and I can feel the relief flood through his body as his breathing finally settles. "You won't regret this," he whispers into my hair. We stay out there as the sky turns shades of orange and purple, my back pressed against his chest while the city watches from below. In that moment, I realize I've fallen completely and irrevocably into something that makes no sense, but feels like the only truth that matters. The following morning, Colby wakes me with a cup of coffee and a stack of palace newspapers. He's already fully dressed, which makes me suspect he never actually closed his eyes, but I'm not about to interrogate him while I'm caffeinating. I just take the mug and try to ignore the way he's been tracking my every move all night, watching me as if I might evaporate the second he blinks. The headlines are impossible to miss because my face is plastered across every single front page. Alpha King's mysterious companion and the woman who changed everything stare back at me in bold ink. There's a shot of us from yesterday wandering the palace grounds, my hand tucked firmly into his while I'm caught mid-laugh at something he'd just said. I sit up, the last traces of sleep vanishing instantly. "This is going to be a problem." "It was always going to happen," Colby says, maintaining a level of calm that is honestly a little frustrating considering my private life is now public property. He sets the papers on the nightstand and sits on the edge of the mattress, looking as comfortable as if we were just discussing the weather. "Your face is going to be everywhere from now on, because that's simply the reality of being with me." I scan the articles and find they aren't actually hostile, though the scrutiny is intense. Some columnists are calling me a breath of fresh air, while others are busy picking apart my background to see if I'm suitable for the role. One editorial even suggests I'm a distraction from his royal duties, as if having a heart makes a man incapable of running a kingdom. Another piece goes as far as analyzing my posture in the photos, trying to calculate my commitment level based on the way I lean into him. Colby reads that specific section over my shoulder without saying a word. I watch his jaw tighten and can practically see the gears turning as he decides whether or not to issue a royal decree about journalistic integrity. Just ignore it, he says eventually. How am I supposed to do that? I ask. Your entire world is staring at me, judging me, and trying to decide if I'm worthy of standing in your shadow. Then let them watch, Colby says, his hand sliding over mine to anchor me. Let them see that the Alpha King chose someone who actually challenges him, someone who doesn't bow just because he has a title, and someone who sees the man instead of the crown. I realize then that he's intentionally building a specific narrative. He doesn't want them to see me as a political pawn or a strategic alliance. He wants them to see the woman who handed him a wrench and told him how to fix a leaky pipe, the one who isn't intimidated by his shadow because she's too busy looking into his eyes. Over the next week, he introduces me to his world in a way that feels both overwhelming and deeply clarifying. I sit through council meetings where he listens far more than he speaks, and I watch him move through ceremonies with a controlled magnetic power. I start to see the physical weight of his position settling over his shoulders like a suit of heavy armor, and I finally understand that leading a kingdom isn't just a job, it's a burden he can never truly set down. My perspective of him shifts during those long days. He isn't just the man who invaded my laundry room with that dangerous, heavy presence and a scent that made my head spin. He is the Alpha King who carries the fate of an entire world on his back, making impossible choices with consequences that reach further than I can even imagine. It's a humbling realization, but it's also the exact reason I know what we have is real. One evening, after a brutal council session regarding pack borders that left his jaw clenched for an hour, he tracks me down in the library. I'm tucked away with a book, mostly just trying to keep my hands busy while my mind processes the sheer scale of the life I'm stepping into. I'm sorry, he says, hovering in the doorway as if he's waiting for an invitation to enter his own room. For what? I ask, letting the book fall shut. For the pressure and the cameras, and for asking you to leave your old life behind. He walks toward me and takes my hand in his. I'm sorry for being what I am, and still asking you to want me anyway. I lace my fingers through his and look up at him. I'm not losing my life, Colby. I'm expanding it, and there is a massive difference between the two. He sinks onto the seat beside me, and for a moment, the silence is heavy and sweet. Are you happy? He asks, and I can hear the genuine doubt in his voice, as if my answer is the only thing allowing him to draw a full breath. Ask me again in 6 months, I tell him softly. It isn't a rejection. It's a promise that I plan on being here long enough for the answer to actually carry weight. He nods, accepting the terms. I will, he promises, and I'll keep asking until the answer is a definitive yes. Later that night, he leads me to a hidden garden I didn't even know the palace held. The moonlight turns the entire world into a landscape of silver and shadow, and strange flowers bloom in the dark as if they're fueled by the night air itself. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain provides a steady, rhythmic pulse that sounds like a heartbeat against the silence. He pulls me into his space and we begin to dance. There isn't any music playing, but I follow his lead anyway, resting my cheek against the steady thrum of his chest. His hand is firm on the small of my back, while his other hand holds mine like I'm the most fragile, precious thing he's ever touched. What's going through your head? I whisper. That I'm terrified of losing you, he admits, dropping the mask of the king for a moment of raw honesty. I'm scared you'll wake up and realize my world is too loud and too much, and that you deserve something better than this chaos. I pull back just enough to meet his eyes. In the moonlight, he looks vulnerable, the terrifying power stripped away to reveal the man underneath. I deserve someone who looks at me like I'm the center of his universe, I say, even when I'm standing in a basement at 6 a.m. wearing damp pajama pants. Especially then, Colby murmurs, and then he kisses me. The kiss is fierce and desperate and full of 1,000 unspoken promises. His hands frame my face as if he's finally found the missing piece of a puzzle, and everything in the world seems to click into place. I realize then that somewhere between the initial mistake and this moment, I've stopped asking questions. I've started to believe in that inevitability he's been talking about since the very beginning. This is my reality now. This man, this weight, and this massive expansion of who I am. It's absolutely terrifying, and it's exactly where I'm supposed to be. 3 months into this new life, a rival pack decides to challenge Colby's right to lead. I don't grasp the severity of the situation at first. He returns from a council meeting with his shoulders locked and a controlled fury radiating off him that makes the air in our bedroom feel like it's vibrating. This is the first time I've seen him truly dark, not directed at me, but focused on an external threat that has dared to question his authority. "Tell me what happened," I say, sitting up and watching him pace the floor with the grace of a predator. "The Blackstone pack is making a move," he says, his voice a low rumble that he's clearly trying to keep in check. "They're claiming that an outsider's influence has made the Alpha King soft, and they're telling the other packs that you're a distraction who has compromised my judgment." A cold weight settles in my stomach. "So, they're using me as the target. They're using you as a weapon," Colby corrects, sitting on the edge of the bed and gripping my hand so hard it's the only thing keeping me grounded. This has been simmering for months because I've been pushing for reforms they hate, suggesting that our system shouldn't just be about raw dominance. They see you as a symbol of my supposed weakness because you don't cower when I walk into a room. What is their end goal? I ask. They've called for a formal challenge, which means a gathering of every pack leader in the territory. They want to put me on trial to see if I'm still fit to lead or if my feelings for you have made me a liability. As I listen, the romantic fog of the last few months clears away. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a high-stakes political game where every move has a ripple effect that touches thousands of lives. Colby's instinct is to fight. I can see it in the way his muscles bunch and the way he talks about asserting dominance and reminding everyone why he wears the crown. He wants to crush the opposition through sheer force of will. I have to be the one to talk him down. "If you go in there and use force, you're just proving they're right," I tell him, reaching out to cup his face and forcing him to meet my eyes. "You'll look defensive and insecure, like you're protecting your ego instead of your people." "Then what do you want me to do?" he asks, and for a split second the king disappears and leaves only the man who trusts me. "Let me prove myself to them," I say. "Not as your mate, but as a person who understands how to build things that actually last. Let them see that I'm not a weakness, but the person who makes you better because I'm the only one who isn't afraid to tell you when you're wrong." He hates the idea immediately. "It's dangerous, Ember. These people aren't going to be polite, and they aren't going to care about your resume or your competence." "Then I'll give them no choice but to care," I reply. We have 2 weeks to prepare for the gathering. 2 weeks to dive into the messy history of pack dynamics and the ancient laws of leadership challenges. Colby becomes my tutor, and we study as if my life depends on it, which, in a very real sense, it does. He walks me through the intricate structure of the packs, explaining how alphas govern and how these challenges have played out over the centuries. He shows me that real power doesn't actually come from physical strength, but from the ability to make choices that keep the collective whole. I memorize the names of every leader who will be there, along with their personal grudges and the specific ways they might be swayed. But more than the studying, he just holds me when the fear starts to feel like it's going to swallow me whole. The night before the meeting, I'm buried under a mountain of books in the library. My brain is fried, my hands are shaking, and I'm wearing one of Colby's oversized sweaters because his scent is the only thing keeping me focused. He appears in the doorway, and I can tell he's been standing there watching me for a long time. He doesn't say a word at first. He just sits across from me and watches as I try to memorize the territories of 17 different pack leaders. "You can still walk away from this," he says softly. I look up from the text. "No, I can't. If I don't do this now, I'll always be the girl you're hiding away. I need to know that I can stand beside you in this world, not just behind you." He reaches across the table and takes my hands, his grip warm and steady. I already know you can. I've known it since the day we met. Then it's time to show everyone else, I say. The gathering is held in a massive, echoing hall that feels like it was built specifically to make people feel small. The marble floors carry the sound of every footstep, and the long tables are arranged so that Colby and I are pinned at the center, surrounded by the most powerful alphas in the country. These aren't just men, they are predators who wear their authority like a second skin. I didn't choose a dress for this. I'm wearing a tailored suit and a structured jacket that makes me feel like I'm wearing armor. My hair is down, but every part of my look is deliberate. I don't look like a distraction. I look like a professional who belongs at the table. Colby introduces me with a formal gravity that signals the start of the end. This is the moment where we either win or everything we've built falls apart. I step forward and I don't talk about love. I talk about systems. I speak about competence and the infrastructure of a kingdom that needs to evolve to survive. I talk about the man who was humble enough to let an outsider see him as human. And I explain that our bond isn't about losing ourselves to each other. It's a partnership where we push each other to be sharper and stronger. I lay out the problems I've seen in their current systems and the solutions I've already started to draft. I tell them that Colby's judgment isn't compromised by me. It's reinforced because I provide the perspective he's been missing. When I finally stop talking, the silence in the room is so thick, you could cut it. Then, one by one, the pack leaders begin to stand. They aren't rising to challenge us. They're rising in a silent show of respect. They recognize that I'm not a decoration or a liability. I'm a force they didn't see coming. Under the table, Colby's hand finds mine, and he squeezes so hard I can feel his relief vibrating through his skin. His eyes are burning with a mix of pride and something so deep it makes my breath hitch. The challenge dies before it can even begin. And in that moment, I finally understand that this is my world now. These people, this crushing responsibility, and this man who saw me in a basement and gave me the space to finally see myself.